Greetings fellow members of the Esoteric Order of Gamers. Well, many moons ago I did a series of videos on using Foamcore. Foamcore to make fantastic box inserts for your games, to keep all the components in order, to ease setup and pack up, and basically to keep everything beautifully organised. I love using Foamcore. Almost every game you see here has got a Foamcore insert that I've made for it. As you can see, I store all my games flat, so I don't have any problems with games pieces falling out if I put them on their side. The reason I don't put them on the side is because pieces can not only fall out of my inserts, but also boards can distort and stuff like that if they're resting at an angle and all that kind of thing. So I prefer to store all my games by size, so they're sitting flat and they're not getting crushed and all the pieces stay in order. Anyway, back to Foamcore. I decided that I would actually film myself making a Foamcore insert so you could see the process. I filmed it ages ago and I finally just got around to doing a voiceover, and it's for the game Rising Sun. Here it is. So, get this one out of the way. Here we go. And here it is. You can see the board and all the pieces sit on the top. Here are all the sort of infantry type figures. We've got a nice card deck here. There we go, that comes out and sits while you're playing the game. And then under these two is another tray with all the other pieces. So I'm going to show you how I made that. I'm also going to show you the other box, which I lined with steel, and I magnetized all the other figures, and there they are. Look, see? Safe as houses. Can turn it upside down even. Wow. Very, very handy. So I hope you find this useful. Let's get right into it. When you're working out your components, just pile them up as you would in the insert and give them a measure so you can see how deep you want your tray to be. Here's my tray. I've laid out all the components that I want in this tray in roughly the places that I want to put them. As you can see, it's all nicely organised. And I'll be building my dividers in this particular tray around this. Now, you'll see as I go on that I changed my mind a bit. These counters, for example, I decided to save some space by putting them all into one square area and separating them with little bits of foam. And that way I managed to save some space because they were very flat and would have taken up lots of space if they were flat. You can see here I've got an area where I can get my thumb in and I can take those tiles out. Right, so moving on to the dividers for this main area. Let me show you how I went about doing this. So I've got a piece which I know is the right height, and I'm just measuring it directly on the insert so I know how long I need it to be. I put a little notch in there, and then using the grid on my cutting mat, which is really handy, I can just line it up with the grid and find out where the 90 degrees is without having to actually measure it and put in two notches. So lining that up, so I've got a 90 degree cut and cutting it where the notch is, making sure I get a nice straight cut, cutting down at a straight 90 degrees so I don't get an angle on that end. And then I do a test fit, so I just see if that fits in. You can see, well, it's a little bit too tight. Bending a bit, so I just want to shave a little bit off the end just so it fits properly. Just a tiny bit. Make sure you've got a sharp knife, of course, and watch those fingers. And then I'll test that fit in there. That looks about right, maybe the other way around. Sometimes you've got to move it upside down and around about because the angles aren't exactly 90 degrees. You might have a slight angle on pieces that you've put in before, and sometimes turning it upside down and trying the other way around will give you a better fit. So just experiment. Putting a bead of white PVA glue on the bottom and the sides of that piece. Try and get that bead of glue just in the middle of the side. So I'll just slide that in there, wipe off any excess glue, and just push it in nicely and give it a bit of a firm press so the glue takes hold. You can use pins to pin it in place while it dries. I'd take the pins out when it's dried, but you can leave them in if you want to. I just think it's neater if I take them out. And then I just want to make sure this is exactly at 90 degrees and all lined up nicely. So I'm looking at it right over the top so I can look down and see that it's at the right angle. And a good way to check that is just take the edge of your metal ruler and place it in there and just make sure that you've got a good 90 degrees on it before it starts setting. You can reposition it if necessary. Scrape off a bit of the extra glue with the edge of a knife if you're careful. And just check that's as straight as possible. Now I'm going to start on the dividers between the little sections in here and just going through the same process as you can see. Measuring it, making a notch, cutting it on the grid, and then adjusting it so it fits right. And it's just a matter of going through these steps repeatedly and building up your insert. You don't have to plan the whole thing ahead of time, you just have to have a rough idea of where you're going to put things, and then just tweak it as you go. You can see I'm just lining up the components there so they're equally spaced, and I know exactly how much space to give this particular compartment. You can see that just using the flat of the blade and scraping it along the edge gets off those little extra bits of glue. Now I'm popping the pieces in and seeing how it works. This looks good. I'm seeing if these pagoda pieces actually fit in there as well. They don't. I'm going to stick with my original design and put those in a separate compartment. Right, there's those compartments done. On to the next one. Now, as you're cutting pieces, save your Foamcore offcuts because you may use them again for other projects. There we go, there's the first row of 3, and you can see it's all very neat and straight. Now, when you're cutting pieces that you want to be the same height, you can just cut one and then use that as a guide for cutting your other pieces. So I want a long straight piece the same height as this piece. I'm just putting in a couple of notches where that height is, and then with a long metal ruler, carefully cutting that piece out. Now, of course, when you're cutting long pieces like this, be very careful that the ruler doesn't move, and be very, very careful of your fingers. You don't have to do it all in one cut. You can do a few shallow cuts. See, I've just used 2 shallow cuts, and that way I make sure the ruler is staying still and I'm not risking hurting my fingers. Just put a bead of glue along the edge. As you can see, just running it along like that will make sure that not too much glue comes out and that you keep the bead of glue in the center of the side so it doesn't squeeze out too much. Right, making good progress here. Here's another piece, and I've almost finished this tray. You can use a ruler to make sure you're getting a straight line of compartments. And it's just a matter of tweaking and checking as you go along to keep it as neat as possible. Don't worry if it's not perfect though. Now you might find that there's a little gap sometimes if the angle isn't perfect and you end up with a gap like this. The way to fix that is just to cut a little sliver of Foamcore as a plug. So here's a very, very thin piece, and I'm going to put a little bit of glue on that, just on both sides, just a dab. And then I'll put that piece in the gap, just pushing away the Foamcore so I can squeeze it in there, clean up the excess glue, and then cut it off so it lines up. You can put a little bit of extra glue over the top just to fill the hole. It's white glue and it'll dry to transparent. And there you have a little plug that's neatly filling that hole and making sure it's a good join. So that's the finished tray. You can see it's working pretty well. I've decided to keep the coins in bags that way because they're easier to get out than scrabbling through a compartment. Sometimes you want to keep components in a Ziploc bag to make it a little bit easier. Got some larger cards under there, so there's several components in that compartment. Remember to allow room for your fingers to get in. If you haven't got an open piece that allows your fingers to get something, then make sure there's a gap there so you can get the pieces out. Right, I'm going to put another tray on top of this, and on top of that will be all these, the board and this rule book and everything. So here's the base piece for that other tray, and I've put all the extra stuff underneath it so I can accurately measure how much room is left in the box. This tray is going to be a little bit different because it will be high on one side and lower on the other, so the board can fit into it. So I'm just making those measurements now. Now that I've got my base piece for the tray, I'm lining the components on it, and I want to make a card dispensing tray. So I'm making a measurement, allowing for the thickness of the Foamcore sides, and measuring that. And then I'm going to cut that piece to size. It's good to make trays like this that you can actually take out of the box and put on the table with all the components already in it. Especially good for cards, of course. Then you have a tray which is not only used for storage but is also used during the play of the game as a card deck holder. Now, because this large piece of Foamcore is the size of the whole tray that I have on this level, if I cut into it, I know that that larger piece I'm just putting aside, I can use that for the other tray that will be on this level. Okay, it's time to start gluing these together. So I'll put some glue on this side. This piece, of course, goes the full width of the tray, so it doesn't need any glue on the edges. You can see I just place it on the edge and then tip it over and put pins in to hold it. One in the middle and one at either end. And that just keeps it exactly in place. Press down there to set the glue. That keeps it in place until it dries. Now I'm going to make this box slightly unusually because what I want to do is make one side of it have gaps in it so I can take the cards out easily. So instead of doing the two long ends and then doing the two short ends, I'm actually doing all the short ends as I place the card decks in it, and you'll see how that works. Right, now it's time to actually start putting the decks of cards in. So as you can see, I'm putting the actual deck in the place it's going to end up, and then measuring the divider, allowing for the fact that I'm going to put another edge at the end of the deck. So I could measure this with a ruler, but I prefer to actually measure it on the piece itself so I know I'm getting it exactly right. So here's the first deck dividing piece. Then I'll put in the second deck and repeat the process. And the third. Now I'm going to make the piece that sits between them, and you'll see this will leave a gap for getting my finger in so I can take the cards out of the deck easily. And when I do this, I cut the Foamcore at a bit of an angle, just to make it look a bit nicer. Now I'll attach those two smaller pieces after making sure they're the same size, and that will finish the deck part of this construction. After the glue is dried on that tray, I'm going to take out all the pins and then put it in place. All that remains now is to make this last tray for these infantry pieces. And with this one, I've cut all the pieces ready to go. You can see the dividing pieces are cut in such a way so the mat board will go on top of this and be held in place snugly. Again, this idea just came out through experimenting and making sure that everything will fit in the right place and not move around too much. Once all these pieces are ready, it's just a matter of gluing them and sticking them in place. And you can see the board fits very snugly there and is held in place by those higher parts of the dividers. Now if I place that in its place, you'll see how this all works. The board fits in there and butts up against the other end of the box, and then all the other pieces sit on top. And there you have it. I wouldn't put it sideways, but it'll sit really nicely on the shelf flat. The next project is to use the other Rising Sun box to store all the figures. And I've actually magnetized those figures, so I want them to be able to sit on the base and the sides of the inside of this box. And to do that, I have to line it with sheet steel. So I have these thin sheets of steel, and using a heavy-duty blade, I run lots of scores along the point where I want to cut it. In the same way as cutting foam core, but I won't be able to cut right through in this case. Again, be very, very careful with your fingers because you're going to do quite hard cuts here, so you want to make sure you don't slip, otherwise you'll make a complete and utter mess of yourself. Just cut that as many times as you can, usually until the blade goes blunt. Once you've scored that as much as you can bend it. Do it on a sharp edge, like the sharp edge of this wood, and give it an initial bend, and then you can bend it again by hand and back and forth a few times, and it will break rather cleanly. Just be very careful with the edges of the steel because they can be sharp and they can easily cut your hands, but you can see just a couple of bends and then it cuts very cleanly. Quite easy to do. Now I could do all this in one piece, of course, but I think I just had some pieces of leftover steel, so I decided to do this in 3 strips, like so. And then using a bit of super glue, I'll attach it to the bottom of the Foamcore box. Now I'm just going to weigh that down with some books as I go while it dries. So here are my 3 pieces on the base. Now I've cut some other pieces for the sides of the box, because the great thing about magnetizing your miniatures is that they don't just have to sit on the bottom, they can sit on the sides as well. And you can really maximize your space that way. And here's my box fully lined with steel. I've put it on 3 sides as well as the base, and then I'll put all my miniatures in. Of course I have to magnetize them first, and that's easily done with a little bit of super glue and some rare earth magnets. Now make sure, of course, you get the polarity of your magnets correct. You want them all to be going the same way. I'm just pressing these down with the cap of the super glue bottle. And then, of course, I'll let this dry for a good long time. I keep my magnets in a stack like this, and then as I pull them off the top of the stack, I can make sure that I place them on the bases the same way around every time. And here's the final result. All the other Rising Sun figures are in here. As you can see, they're snug as a bug in a rug. They're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to shake around or get damaged. That's it, folks. A look at making a Foamcore insert for Rising Sun, but you can use these techniques for any one of your board games, of course. As I said, you don't have to plan ahead of time and make careful 3D plans and measure things. You can just put your components on the piece of Foamcore that's a base, or your base box, and start doing dividers and start designing it as you go. It's actually really easy once you get the hang of it. I really recommend that you give it a go and make fantastic Foamcore inserts for your games to keep them in tip-top condition. I'll see you next time, folks. That's the Esoteric Order of Gamers, orderofgamers.com. Hope you enjoyed this, and be sure to check out all the other wonderful stuff that the Esoteric Order of Gamers has on offer, and check us out on Patreon as well. See you next time. Good gaming.